Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm ffinlo Costain. Earthworms are vital for healthy soils, but they face an uncertain future due to climate change. Now, Professor Mark Hodson from the University of York will look at how predicted increases in the intensity, frequency, and the duration of flooding is impacting the population. I spoke to Mark and I asked him what he expects to find.
Okay, well, that's a good question. Of course, we've got some hypotheses, the things we expect to find, but really we're not absolutely certain, else we wouldn't have to do the research. But what we're looking at really is the impacts of flooding on earthworms. And in broad terms, what we're expecting to find is that flooding is a bad thing for earthworms, and after floods, earthworms die. We think they drown. So earthworm numbers will reduce. We also think that the types of species we find will change as well. We think we'll find that some earthworm species are more sensitive to flooding than others. So that if you get flooding, you'll get an effect on the population structure of the earthworms. And that can have effects on soils because different earthworm species do different things. So those are the two key things that we're hoping to confirm or check out in this research.
Will he be looking at different terrains or largely in field settings?
Largely in a field setting and floodplains, because those are the areas which flood. Of course, the issue is with our changing climate that more areas than previously are starting to experience floods. So we'll be sort of working around rivers, fields adjacent to rivers, which have a history of flooding, and then fields adjacent to those fields which generally don't flood at the moment. So that's going to allow us to do sort of compare and contrast observations, if you like. We'll be able to compare the fields which we know flood on a regular basis with those fields which don't flood at the moment, which will be vulnerable as flooding becomes more frequent and more extensive over time.
You mentioned earthworm species. How many different earthworm species are there, and in what way do they vary?
Okay, so I think at the last count, there are 27 species in the UK, maybe 29. There's some debate about that amongst taxonomists. So they vary in a number of ways. In broad terms, there are three different types of earthworms. Some live on the surface of the soil in the litter layer. They're called epigeics. Some have fairly permanent vertical burrows called anisics, and some actually live in the soil and sort of move through the soil, consuming the soil. Those are endogeics. So the anisics, for example, they're generally the big fat ones that you see, things like Lumbricus terrestris. They pull vegetation, dead vegetation, into the soil. So they'll sort of clear stuff off the surface and pull it into the soil. The endogeics, which go through the soil, will then sort of break that material down, releasing nutrients into the soil. And the epigeics will help break down the leaf litter layer on the surface of the soil. So they all do subtly different things.
Why are earthworms so important for soils?
Generally, because they help the soil function. So you know, there's great research out there that show that earthworms can boost plant growth by up to about 25%, for example. And someone did some modelling to say that about 6.5% of the world's grain production is dependent on earthworms. So they break down organic matter, and that releases nutrients, which then boosts plant growth. They aerate the soil through their burrowing. They can also change the structure of the soil. So they produce these little balls of soil called aggregates, and that helps soil store water, for example, and retain nutrients. And then on top of that, they're also important in the food chain. So I was thinking about this before we chatted. In a sense, if you're a bird or a fox, an earthworm is a bit like a sausage. It's full of protein and really good to eat. So birds, foxes, badgers, lots of mammals are dependent on earthworms for food as well. So there's that important role in the food chain.
And when fields flood, just how devastating is it for earthworm communities and indeed biodiversity more broadly?
So pretty bad. So I can't comment on biodiversity more broadly. That's not my research field. And as you know, academics we get obsessed with particular things. So my obsession's earthworms. So what you generally find, and it's the source of this, the origin of this research is pretty bad for earthworms. So certainly when we were looking at some sites which didn't usually flood, and there was a flood, and then the waters retreated, and the surface of the soil was littered with dead earthworms, and that's not a new observation. Darwin, who his last book in the late 1800s was on earthworms, has observed this as well. So in the immediate aftermath of a flood, you see a major reduction in earthworm numbers. And the key thing is, and another thing we're looking at in this research, is how quickly does that population recover? And that will in part depend on the cocoons, the earthworm eggs in the soil, and whether they can survive the effects of flooding, but also how quickly earthworms can move back into that area. But in the immediate aftermath of flooding, pretty devastating. And the research we've done to date shows that sites which do regularly flood have a very depleted earthworm population. So there's a long-term effect there as well.
Will you be looking at the impact of different lengths of flood as well?
So that's a really good question and something we'd like to know. Our initial experiments suggest that might not be the case. They're lab-based experiments, and you always have to be careful about moving from the lab to the field because the field's a far more complicated place than our controlled lab environments. In our lab, so the issue with flooding is that when the flood waters come in, the bacteria in the soil continue to break down the organic matter and use up the oxygen. So the soils become oxygen depleted, and that's when the earthworms suffocate. So initially they're fine in the water. They breathe through their skin and there's oxygen in the water, so they're fine. But say the oxygen levels decrease and therefore they suffocate. In the lab, when we flood soil, that happens usually within about 24 hours, the oxygen levels drop and the earthworms start to die within 24 hours. Depending on the species, some of them hang on for like 3 or 4 days. So there's probably going to be a time component in the soils in the field, but that's something we'd like to look at.
But earthworms are able to cope if they're in water for a shorter period of time.
Yeah, in many ways, they're aquatic organisms. You know, they're soft-bodied. They don't have lungs. The oxygen in the water that's present in the soil diffuses through their skin, or the oxygen in the pore space in the soil diffuses through their skin, and that's how they breathe. So as long as there's enough oxygen there, they're fine. They say the issue is that when the floodwaters come in, over time the oxygen levels decrease because the bacteria are busy breaking down the organic matter. And when the oxygen levels drop below a certain point, then the earthworms start to drown.
Is it just flooding that threatens earthworms, or are there other climate impacts that affect them too?
You know, poor old earthworms are a bit of a sticky wicket, really, on climate change. So obviously there's the flooding, but droughts are bad news as well. So because they're soft-bodied organisms, earthworms have difficulty um, retaining moisture when it gets dry. So some earthworms get around this by doing something called estivating. It's a bit like hibernating, but you do it in the summer. And essentially, when the conditions become too unpleasant for the earthworms, they curl up into a little ball. They sort of essentially shut down their metabolism. They essentially hibernate and they wait it out until the soil becomes moist again. Others can sort of burrow quite deep. You can get earthworm burrows down to sort of 2 or 3 meters if there's that thickness of soil. And down there, you've got a certain amount of protection from drought and drying out. But nonetheless, droughts are bad news as well. So it's kind of like a double whammy. We've got the floods. If you've got more frequent and extensive floods, you're going to get more earthworm drowning events. And then come the summer, if you've got more drought events, that's also going to be bad news for the earthworms. So we've got separate projects where we're trying to get. I say we've got separate projects. We're trying to get money for separate projects looking at the drought side of the story as well. So both the flooding and the drought are bad news for earthworms.
You mentioned hibernation there. How long can they hibernate for?
Another excellent question. Don't know the answer to that at the moment. We've got students working on that, certainly weeks. But although the earthworms have sort of shut down their metabolism, there's got to be a limit to how long they can last in that state. And again, that's something we'd love to know.
What methods are you going to use to carry out the research?
Okay, so a whole host of methods. We're going to do some field work, essentially just visiting fields before and after flooding. So there's a bit of a challenge there, predicting when a flood's going to happen, of course. And that's just going to be sampling earthworms, looking at earthworm numbers, species present, absent, that sort of thing. And then we're also going to do some lab work where we take waters of known oxygen levels and see how the earthworms cope with that. So then we can predict whether, well, at what point the earthworms would start to drown. And we're going to do similar sort of experiments with the earthworm cocoons, their eggs, to see how viable the cocoons remain if flooding occurs as well.
Do you already have a sense of what farmers and land managers can do differently to reduce the threat, whether it's from flood or drought, to earthworm populations?
Yeah, so I'm not sure it's different because some farmers are already doing this. And of course, I'm always slightly wary about academics advising farmers what to do because farmers know far more about their soils than we do. But the two key things that you can do to support earthworms are firstly to reduce the amount of disturbance of the soil. So any form of ploughing is bad news for earthworms. There's the sort of the risk of cutting earthworms up with a plough, but also as you turn the soil over, that exposes the earthworms, and that's why you get flocks of seagulls following the tractors in the fields. So that's one thing. So of course, many farmers are doing that now and moving away from conventional ploughing. And the other thing is to try and boost the amount of organic matter in your soil. So there's a whole host of good reasons why that would be a good thing, but it does help soils retain moisture, and it does provide food for earthworms as well. So anything you can do to boost the organic content of your soil is good news for earthworms, as well as generally good news for your soil.
That was Professor Mark Hodson from the University of York. More news as ever on our website 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.